What would you do if the person you trusted most betrayed you in the worst way imaginable? My name is Michael, and this is the story of how I uncovered my wife's betrayal at a New Year's party, and why I couldn't confront her. Stay with me because this isn't just a story about heartbreak. It's a story about survival, self-discovery, and learning to break free from chains I didn't even know I wore. By the end, you'll understand why it's so important to know your worth and stand up for it, no matter what it costs. The New Year's party was supposed to be routine. Another evening of false laughter, polite conversation, and pretending I belonged in a world where money meant everything. My boss, Richard, had a flair for extravagance, hosting his annual party at his mansion, a palatial estate that oozed wealth. The grand staircase, spiraling like something out of a fairy tale, greeted guests with a sense of intimidation. Every surface gleamed, from the polished marble floors to the crystal chandeliers casting a golden glow over the room. Elizabeth loved these events. She thrived in the glow of attention, the way people hung on her every word. That night she was breathtaking. Her red dress hugged her figure perfectly, the fabric shimmering under the warm lights. Her dark hair cascaded over her shoulders, and her lips, painted a deep crimson, curled into a smile that could disarm anyone. I watched her from the edge of the room, clutching a whiskey glass like a lifeline. She had always been the star, and I was her shadow. It was a dynamic I had come to accept, though it stung more than I cared to admit. While she mingled effortlessly, moving from one group to the next, I lingered in the background. A few of my colleagues offered polite nods, but the conversations were superficial at best. As the night wore on, I noticed Richard approach Elizabeth. His towering frame exuded authority, his perfectly tailored suit a testament to his power. They were talking, their body language casual but charged with an energy I couldn't quite place. He laughed, leaning in closer. She responded with a laugh of her own, a sound I had once thought was just for me. Then came the touch. It was subtle, a hand on her lower back. It lingered a moment too long, fingers splaying slightly as if marking his territory. My chest tightened, but I told myself not to overreact. Richard was a tactile person, always quick with a handshake or a pat on the back. This didn't have to mean anything, but as the minutes ticked by, I saw their heads incline toward each other. They weren't just talking. They were whispering. My whiskey turned bitter in my mouth. Suddenly, they moved, together, away from the crowd. My heart began to race as I followed them, trying to stay unnoticed. My mind was a storm of conflicting emotions. Confusion, anger, fear. The sound of their laughter drifted down the hall, faint but distinct, leading me like a dark melody. When I found them, it was in Richard's private study. The door was ajar, just enough for me to see inside. My breath hitched in my throat as I took in the scene. Elizabeth leaning against his desk, Richard standing close, too close. And then it happened. He kissed her. For a second, I thought I had imagined it. My mind refused to process the reality before me. But there it was, undeniable, inescapable. Her arms slid around his neck as if it were the most natural thing in the world. The world around me seemed to shatter. I wanted to burst into the room, to scream, to demand an explanation, but my legs felt like they were anchored to the floor. My hands clenched into fists, trembling with rage, but I couldn't move. Richard was my boss, the man who had the power to destroy my career with a single word. If I confronted him, what would happen? And Elizabeth, what would she say? Would she lie? Twist the narrative to make me the villain? So, I stood there, paralyzed, watching my wife betray me in a way that felt almost calculated. When they finally broke apart, Elizabeth adjusted her dress and slipped out of the room, her face alight with the same radiant smile she had worn all evening. She didn't see me standing in the shadows, didn't notice the storm raging in my chest. Back in the main hall, she mingled as if nothing had happened, her laugh floating above the hum of conversation. I watched her, every smile and every touch now laced with poison. When we got home, she kicked off her heels and poured herself a glass of wine. She seemed relaxed, almost euphoric. "Didn't you have fun tonight?" she asked, her voice light and cheerful, as if she hadn't just shattered my world. I stared at her, searching for a crack in her facade. There was none. Yeah, I lied, my voice hollow. That night I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed, the image of her in Richard's arms replaying endlessly in my mind. Each time it felt like a fresh wound, deeper and more painful than the last. I had always thought betrayal would feel sudden, like a punch to the gut. But this was slower, more insidious. It was the unraveling of everything I thought I knew about my wife, my marriage, and myself. As dawn broke, spilling pale light into the room, I stared at the ceiling, hollow and numb. Somewhere deep inside, a part of me whispered a truth I wasn't ready to face. This wasn't the beginning of her betrayal. It was simply the first time I couldn't ignore it. The morning after the party felt surreal. The house was eerily quiet except for the faint sound of birds chirping outside the window. The light pouring through the blinds felt intrusive, like it was shining on the cracks I was desperate to hide. Elizabeth was already up, humming softly as she moved through the kitchen. The clinking of dishes and the aroma of coffee filled the air. She looked radiant, as if the previous night had left her invigorated rather than drained. I couldn't understand it. How could she carry on so effortlessly after what she'd done? I stayed in bed longer than usual, staring at the ceiling, replaying the scene I'd witnessed over and over. Every detail burned into my memory. The way Richard touched her, the way she leaned into him, the kiss. My stomach churned at the thought. Eventually, I dragged myself out of bed, each step toward the kitchen heavier than the last. Elizabeth greeted me with her usual bright smile, as though everything was perfectly normal. "Good morning, sleepyhead," she chirped, handing me a steaming mug of coffee. "You were out cold last night. Guess the party wore you out." Huh. Her tone was casual, her words light, but they cut me like a knife. I forced a weak smile, taking the mug from her without meeting her eyes. "Yeah," I muttered, the word tasting bitter on my tongue. She didn't stop there. "You really need to loosen up at these events," she said, stirring cream into her own coffee. "You looked so stiff standing in the corner all night. People noticed that, you know." Her criticism was nothing new, but today, it felt like salt in an open wound. My hands tightened around the mug, the heat burning my palms, but I didn't respond. What could I say? That I knew where she'd disappeared to? That I'd seen her betray me with Richard? Instead, I swallowed my words and nodded, pretending to absorb her advice like always. Elizabeth's monologue continued as she moved around the kitchen, her voice animated as she recapped the highlights of the party. She praised Richard for being such a gracious host, casually mentioning how fun and charismatic he was. The way she spoke about him made my skin crawl. I tried to tune her out, focusing on the black liquid swirling in my cup, but her voice was relentless. Each word felt like a barb, digging deeper into the pit of my stomach. "Did you see the way he handled that drunk guy?" she asked, laughing. "Richard's such a natural leader. No wonder he's so successful." I couldn't take it anymore. "Yeah," I said, my voice sharper than I intended. "He's definitely something." Elizabeth paused, her eyes narrowing slightly as she studied me. For a brief moment, I thought she might sense the tension simmering beneath the surface, but then she shrugged and moved on. As the morning wore on, I found myself retreating into silence, letting her words wash over me without truly hearing them. I felt trapped, suffocated by the weight of what I knew and the impossibility of confronting her. By the time she left for her yoga class, the house was quiet again. I sat at the kitchen table, staring at the untouched breakfast she'd made for me. The eggs had gone cold, the toast limp. My appetite was non-existent. My mind raced with questions I couldn't answer. How long had this been going on? Was it just Richard, or had there been others? Did she even care about me anymore? Or was I just a convenient placeholder in her life? The thought of confronting her filled me with dread. Elizabeth wasn't just manipulative. She was skilled at turning every argument in her favor. I could already hear her voice, dripping with indignation. "Are you really accusing me of something so ridiculous? You've always been so insecure, Michael." I spent the rest of the day in a fog, going through the motions but feeling detached from my own life. Even mundane tasks like folding laundry felt insurmountable. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw them together, her hands on his shoulders, his lips on hers. By evening, Elizabeth returned, her energy unshaken. She talked about her yoga class, her plans for the week, the latest gossip from her friends. I nodded in all the right places, but inside, I was screaming. That night, as we lay in bed, she fell asleep quickly, her breathing soft and steady. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, the weight of my silence crushing me. I wanted to shake her awake, to force her to admit the truth, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. I realized then that this wasn't just about her betrayal. It was about the years of manipulation, the subtle erosion of my confidence, the way she made me feel small. I had let this happen. I had let her take control of my life, my happiness. As the hours ticked by, one thought consumed me. Something had to change. The following days blurred together, each one dragging me further into an emotional abyss I couldn't escape. Elizabeth carried on as if nothing had happened, her demeanor cheerful and her schedule packed with social events, errands, and her yoga sessions. She was a master of appearances, effortlessly weaving through life while I struggled to keep mine from unraveling. I returned to work on Monday, hoping the routine might numb the storm inside me. But walking into the office felt like stepping into a lion's den. Richard's voice carried across the open floor plan, his laughter booming as he commanded the attention of a group near the coffee station. I avoided him, retreating to my desk and burying myself in spreadsheets and reports. My work had always been my escape, a place where logic reigned and emotions could be pushed aside. But that day, every number I entered, every email I sent, felt meaningless. The image of him and Elizabeth together was a shadow that followed me, refusing to fade. At lunch, I couldn't avoid him any longer. Richard spotted me in the break room, his smile wide as he clapped a hand on my shoulder. The weight of it felt oppressive. "Michael, hell of a party, huh?" His voice was warm, friendly, completely devoid of the guilt I had hoped to see. I forced a smile, my jaw tight. "Yeah, it was something," I said, keeping my tone as neutral as possible. He leaned in, lowering his voice conspiratorially. "You know, I was just telling the guys you're lucky to have Elizabeth. She's a real charmer. Life of the party." My stomach twisted. I couldn't tell if his words were meant to taunt me or if he genuinely believed he was paying me a compliment. Either way, it took everything in me not to lash out. "Yeah," I managed, my voice barely audible. "She is." The rest of the day passed in a haze. I avoided Richard as much as possible, ignoring his attempts to draw me into conversations and meetings. By the time I got home, I was emotionally drained, my nerves frayed. Elizabeth greeted me with her usual enthusiasm, asking about my day and launching into a detailed account of hers before I could answer. She seemed oblivious to my silence, her words filling the room like static. "Guess who I ran into at the cafe today?" she said, her eyes sparkling. "Claire from yoga. She said we should do a couples retreat next month. Doesn't that sound fun?" I stared at her, the absurdity of her suggestion almost making me laugh. A retreat to fix a marriage she didn't even realize was broken. "Sure," I said flatly, knowing she wouldn't notice the lack of conviction in my voice. Later that evening, as we sat on the couch watching a show I wasn't paying attention to, I decided to test the waters. "You and Richard seemed pretty close at the party," I said casually, keeping my eyes on the screen. Elizabeth barely flinched. "Richard? Oh please, he's like that with everyone. You know how he is, always over the top." She waved a hand dismissively, her tone light, but there was a flicker of something in her eyes. Annoyance? Suspicion? I didn't press further. I knew her well enough to recognize the beginnings of her defenses. If I pushed too hard, she'd turn the conversation against me, painting me as paranoid or insecure. That night, as she slept beside me, I lay awake again, consumed by doubt and anger. Her casual dismissal of my comment only confirmed what I already knew. She wasn't going to admit anything. Not willingly. The next morning, I made a decision. I couldn't keep living like this, trapped in silence, consumed by betrayal. If Elizabeth wouldn't give me the truth, I'd find it myself. I started small, checking her phone while she showered. My hands trembled as I scrolled through her messages, expecting to find damning evidence. But there was nothing incriminating, just threads of mundane conversations with friends and coworkers. Frustrated but undeterred, I began paying closer attention to her behavior. I noticed the way she smiled when her phone buzzed, the way she angled the screen away from me as she typed. I started tracking her comings and goings, noting every inconsistency, every unexplained delay. The cracks in her story were there, subtle but undeniable. I just needed to piece them together. And as I dug deeper, I realized something terrifying. This wasn't just about Elizabeth and Richard. It was about me, about the version of myself I had lost somewhere along the way. The decision to dig deeper into Elizabeth's life felt both empowering and sickening. Empowering, because I was finally doing something instead of drowning in silent anguish. Sickening, because the act of investigating my wife, of treating her like a suspect, felt like a betrayal of my own values. But what choice did I have? The truth was like a splinter lodged deep in my mind. It hurt every time I thought about it, and the only way to ease the pain was to pry it out, no matter how ugly it might be. Elizabeth's routine didn't change much in the days that followed. She woke early, went to yoga or ran errands, met friends for coffee, and came home with a smile as if she had nothing to hide. She had perfected the art of appearing flawless, but now I was watching her through a different lens, one that caught the cracks in her facade. One evening, when she went to her usual yoga class, I decided to follow her. It was reckless, I knew, but my desperation outweighed my sense of reason. I waited until she left, then grabbed my keys and trailed her car from a safe distance. The drive was uneventful at first, just a familiar route through our neighborhood and toward the fitness studio she frequented. But then, she passed the turn she usually took. My pulse quickened as I followed her onto a different road, one that led away from the studio. Where was she going? The question clawed at my mind as I kept my distance, the glow of her taillights a beacon in the dark. She pulled into the parking lot of a small cafe, a quiet, tucked-away place I'd never seen before. I parked a block away and walked toward the cafe, keeping my head low and my distance safe. Through the large windows, I spotted her immediately. She wasn't alone. Richard was sitting across from her, his posture relaxed and confident, a stark contrast to my own tense frame. Elizabeth was laughing, her hand resting lightly on the table between them. It wasn't an intimate gesture, but the ease between them was undeniable. I ducked behind a parked car, my breath coming in short bursts. My mind raced with possibilities. Was this just a casual meeting? A coincidence? Or was it something more? For over an hour, I watched them from the shadows. They talked, laughed, leaned in closer than seemed necessary. At one point, Richard reached across the table and brushed a strand of hair from her face. My stomach churned. When they finally stood to leave, I quickly retreated to my car, watching as they walked out together. Richard opened the door of his luxury sedan for her, a gesture that felt both gentlemanly and possessive. She climbed in and they drove off. I didn't follow this time. Couldn't. My hands were trembling too much to grip the steering wheel, my vision blurred by a haze of anger and disbelief. When I got home, Elizabeth was already there, lounging on the couch with a glass of wine. She looked up as I walked in, her face lighting up as if nothing had happened. "Hey, you're home late," she said casually. "Everything okay?" I forced a smile, nodding. "Yeah, just got caught up at work." She didn't press further, her attention already drifting back to the show she was watching. That night, as she slept soundly beside me, I sat in the living room, replaying the scene at the cafe in my mind. I wanted to confront her, to demand answers, but I knew it wasn't time. Not yet. I needed proof, real proof that she couldn't deny or twist. So, I resolved to keep digging. The next morning, I called out sick from work and spent hours researching Richard. I scoured his social media, his company profiles, even obscure interviews and articles. I wanted to find something, anything, that might give me leverage or insight into his relationship with Elizabeth. What I found instead was a pattern. Richard had a reputation, whispered about in hushed tones by former employees and buried in anonymous online forums. Words like predator and manipulative appeared more than once, along with vague stories of ruined marriages and destroyed careers. The more I read, the clearer it became. Richard wasn't just a powerful man. He was a dangerous one. And Elizabeth was caught in his web, or worse, willingly entangled herself in it. By the end of the day, I felt no closer to answers, only more questions. How deep did this go? Was she a victim, or was she complicit? And most importantly, what was I going to do about it? As the sun set, casting long shadows across the room, one thing became clear. My life was no longer my own. It belonged to the secrets, the lies, and the desperate pursuit of truth. And I wasn't sure I'd survive finding it. The days following my discovery at the cafe felt like walking on a tightrope strung above a pit of razor-sharp truths. Every interaction with Elizabeth became a test of my ability to act normal, to suppress the volcanic rage building inside me. She was as vibrant as ever, laughing easily, her charm on full display. It was like living with a stranger, a version of her I didn't recognize but had apparently existed all along. Her mask was flawless, and now I had to wear one too. Work was no better. Richard's presence was suffocating, his voice grating every nerve I had. He seemed emboldened, more brazen, as if he knew he had the upper hand. My mind constantly replayed their meeting at the cafe, dissecting every detail. But it wasn't enough. I needed more. One night, after Elizabeth had fallen asleep, I crept out of bed and went to her phone. My heart pounded as I unlocked it, an act that felt both exhilarating and soul-crushing. The messages were still clean, carefully curated. If she and Richard were communicating, they weren't doing it here. Then I checked her emails. Most were mundane. Promotions from stores, updates from her yoga group, newsletters she never read. But one email thread stood out, a reservation confirmation for a boutique hotel downtown. It was booked for the upcoming weekend. 2 names were listed, Elizabeth and Richard. The air felt like it had been sucked out of the room. I stared at the screen, my mind racing. They weren't even trying to hide it anymore. The audacity of it stung almost as much as the betrayal itself. The next morning, I couldn't look at her. She was radiant as ever, sipping her coffee and scrolling through her phone. She glanced up at me and smiled. "You're quiet today," she said, tilting her head slightly. "Just tired," I replied, forcing my voice to sound steady. She nodded, accepting the answer without question. "Maybe you should take a break this weekend," she suggested. "Go hang out with the guys or something. I'm thinking of having a little self-care day." Self-care. The words dripped with irony. I nodded, unable to speak, and she returned to her scrolling, oblivious to the storm brewing inside me. The weekend arrived faster than I was prepared for. Elizabeth left early Saturday morning, dressed impeccably as always, claiming she was meeting friends for brunch. I watched her drive off, my hands trembling as I gripped the steering wheel of my own car, ready to follow. She drove downtown, weaving through traffic with the ease of someone who had nothing to hide. I kept my distance, my pulse racing as I followed her to the boutique hotel from the email. She parked and walked inside without hesitation. I waited, my heart pounding as I debated my next move. Confront her now? Wait for Richard to show up? Before I could decide, he arrived. His car, sleek and polished, pulled into the lot like it belonged there. He stepped out, exuding the same smug confidence I had come to loathe. Without even glancing around, he walked into the hotel. I sat frozen, my hands gripping the wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. My mind screamed at me to do something, to storm inside and confront them, but my body refused to move. Fear rooted me in place. Fear of the fallout, the humiliation, the confirmation of everything I had suspected. Hours passed. I stayed parked outside, watching as other guests came and went, but there was no sign of Elizabeth or Richard. When they finally emerged, it was dusk. They walked out together, laughing, her arm casually brushing his. I felt sick. They parted ways, Richard heading to his car and Elizabeth walking to hers with the same unbothered air she always carried. She drove home, humming along to the radio as if nothing was amiss. When she walked through the door, she greeted me with a bright smile and a kiss on the cheek. "How was your day?" she asked, her voice sweet and melodic. I stared at her, trying to reconcile the woman before me with the one I had just seen. My silence stretched on too long, and her brow furrowed slightly. Michael? She pressed, her tone tinged with curiosity. It was fine, I said finally, the words scraping against my throat like glass. That night, as she fell asleep beside me, I lay awake, the weight of everything crushing me. I realized then that this wasn't just about her betrayal. It was about the years of manipulation, the lies, the slow erosion of trust that had left me a hollow shell. And as the hours ticked by, one thought consumed me. I couldn't live like this anymore. It was impossible to ignore the gnawing feeling inside me any longer. The silence between Elizabeth and I had become suffocating. Every glance felt loaded with unspoken words. I couldn't keep pretending. The weekend passed in a blur of half-hearted conversations and forced smiles. Elizabeth didn't notice. She was too busy with her own world, oblivious to the slow collapse of ours. It felt like she was living in a different universe, one where her lies could continue without consequence. On Monday morning, I made a choice. I had to confront her. The uncertainty, the fear, the endless waiting. It all had to stop. I found myself sitting across from her at the kitchen table, the same table where we had shared so many mundane conversations. This time, there was no warmth in the air, just a heavy tension that pressed down on us both. Elizabeth, I started, my voice barely above a whisper. We need to talk. She looked up, her eyes flashing with that familiar blend of curiosity and defensiveness. What about? About Richard? I said, my hands trembling as I spoke. About the hotel, the weekend. Her face changed in an instant. The calm, collected mask she wore faltered. What are you talking about? She asked, her voice suddenly cold. I know everything, I said, barely able to keep my voice steady. I know about the hotel, about you and Richard. For a moment, she said nothing. Then, slowly, she stood up and walked to the window, her back turned to me. You've been spying on me? She asked quietly. I followed you, I admitted. I saw you with him. I saw everything. Her shoulders tensed, and for a moment, I thought she might turn around and deny everything. But instead, she sighed. Michael, don't. I interrupted, standing up, my voice cracking. Just tell me the truth. Don't lie to me anymore. I can't take it. She finally turned, her eyes filled with something I couldn't quite place. Regret, guilt, or maybe just exhaustion. I didn't mean for it to happen. It's not what you think. But I didn't need to hear the excuses anymore. I had seen enough, felt enough to know what was happening. This wasn't a mistake. It was a betrayal. I don't want to hear it, I said quietly, my heart breaking with every word. I'm done. With that, I turned and walked out, the weight of the decision hitting me all at once. I had no plan, no idea where I would go or what I would do. But I couldn't stay in a house that felt like a prison. As I closed the door behind me, I knew this was only the beginning. The night was cold as I walked aimlessly through the streets, my mind spiraling with a mixture of anger and disbelief. I had always prided myself on being a man of logic, of patience. But now, I felt like a stranger in my own life, cut adrift in a sea of confusion. I had left everything behind. The house, the marriage, and the life I thought I knew. Elizabeth was still inside, probably trying to piece together what had just happened. I couldn't even begin to imagine how she would justify it to herself, or worse, how she might try to justify it to me. I called a cab, not knowing where I was going, just wanting to be as far from her as possible. The city's lights blurred past me as the cab driver took me downtown, to a part of the city I hadn't visited in years. It was gritty, full of bars and dimly lit streets, the kind of place where people went to escape, to hide. I stumbled out of the cab and wandered into the first bar I saw. The dim lighting and hum of muffled conversations felt like a momentary reprieve. I ordered a drink, hoping to numb the ache in my chest. But it didn't work. The alcohol burned, but it couldn't erase the image of Elizabeth and Richard. The bartender was a middle-aged man with a tired expression. He poured my drink without a word, as if he had seen men like me before. Men who had their worlds turned upside down, who came to drown their sorrows in anonymity. I found a quiet corner and sank into the seat, staring at the ice cubes in my glass, trying to make sense of everything. But the more I thought, the more I realized there was no way to make sense of it. Elizabeth's betrayal wasn't something that could be fixed with a conversation or an apology. She had made her choice, and now I had to make mine. I couldn't keep chasing after someone who didn't care about me. The truth was, I had been chasing her for years. Chasing her love, her attention, her validation. But now I saw it for what it was. An endless pursuit that would only leave me empty. I spent the rest of the night in the bar, the drink numbing the edges of my pain, but nothing could dull the truth. By the time the sun began to rise, I knew that I couldn't go back to her. The relationship was over, even if the final nail hadn't been driven in just yet. I made my way back to the apartment, not knowing what I was going to do or say. The door was still closed when I arrived, and the lights inside were dim. As I stood in front of it, my hand resting on the doorknob, I realized something. I had nothing left to say. I could feel her presence inside, but I also knew that once I stepped through that door, I would be walking into a lie. I turned away without another word, walking into the unknown, leaving behind a life I had once thought I could hold on to. I didn't know where I was going. All I knew was that I couldn't stay in the city, not with her lingering everywhere, in every corner, every memory. I needed a fresh start, a place where I could clear my head and figure out what to do next. I drove aimlessly, the miles passing in a blur. The further I went, the more my mind quieted, and for the first time in days, I felt a small measure of peace. I ended up in a small town about 2 hours away. It wasn't much, just a quiet place with a few old shops, a couple of diners, and a sense of stillness that I desperately needed. I checked into a small motel, not caring about the peeling paint or the flickering light above the door. It was just a place to rest, to stop running. I tossed my bag onto the bed and sat on the edge, staring out the window at the empty streets. I couldn't escape the thoughts, though. Elizabeth, Richard, the betrayal, they followed me like shadows, always just behind me. I had no idea what I was supposed to do next. I spent the next few days in the town, trying to find some semblance of normalcy. I took long walks, drank coffee at the local diner, and let my thoughts run wild. But the more I tried to escape, the clearer it became. I wasn't just running from Elizabeth. I was running from myself. One evening, as I sat in the diner, I overheard a conversation between two locals. They were talking about a man who had left his wife for another woman. They laughed about it, but the words hit me like a punch to the gut. It was my story they were telling. I tried to ignore it, but I couldn't. I felt like a fool for letting everything fall apart, for letting Elizabeth pull me into this web of lies and manipulation. But there was something else gnawing at me, a question I couldn't ignore. Why had I let her control me for so long? Why hadn't I seen the truth before? It was a sobering thought, but it was also the beginning of something. I realized I couldn't keep running. I couldn't hide from the mess I had made. It was time to face it, to confront my past and take control of my future. The silence in the motel room felt suffocating. I had spent days hiding from reality, but I couldn't do it any longer. The constant buzzing of unanswered questions in my mind wouldn't let me rest. I knew I had to go back, not to fix things with Elizabeth, but to confront everything I had been avoiding. The betrayal, the lies, the years of blind acceptance. It was time to face the truth head-on. I packed my things and drove back to the city, my heart pounding with every mile. The closer I got, the more I felt the weight of what was to come. When I arrived at the apartment, it was late. The building looked the same as it always did, but everything felt different. I stood outside for a moment, unsure of what to do next. Should I knock? Should I just leave and never look back? I took a deep breath and rang the bell. Elizabeth opened the door, looking surprised but not particularly shaken. She had likely been expecting me, but I wasn't sure if she was prepared for what was coming. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her voice flat, guarded. "I need to talk," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, though my anger was bubbling just beneath the surface. She stepped aside, and I walked in, my eyes scanning the room that had once been our home. Felt empty now, hollow. There was no warmth, no comfort, just a collection of memories I could no longer trust. We stood in the middle of the room, neither of us speaking for a moment. The tension between us was thick, suffocating. I don't know what to say. Elizabeth finally broke the silence, her voice wavering slightly. I never meant for any of this to happen. I couldn't stop the bitterness from creeping into my words. But it did happen, didn't it? You betrayed me. You lied. You chose him over me. Her eyes welled with tears, but I couldn't bring myself to feel sorry for her. I didn't want to hurt you, Michael. I was lost. I didn't know how to handle it. Handle what? I asked, incredulous. Your affair? Your constant lies? How long were you planning on keeping this from me? She looked down, her shoulders trembling. I don't know. I thought maybe I could fix it. I didn't want to lose you. But you already have, I said, the words feeling like daggers as they left my mouth. There was a long silence. Her face crumpled, and she collapsed onto the couch, her sobs filling the space between us. I didn't move, couldn't. My anger was fading, replaced by a cold, painful clarity. This was it. This was the end. There was nothing left to salvage. I'm sorry, she whispered, but the apology felt hollow. I nodded, finally allowing myself to feel the weight of the situation. I don't want your apology. I just want to move on. She looked up at me, eyes red and swollen. Please don't leave. I don't know how to fix this. You can't, I said quietly. You already broke it. There's no fixing it now. And with that, I turned and walked out. I didn't look back. As I left the apartment for good, I felt a strange sense of relief. It was over. The lies, the confusion, the endless questioning. It was done. But in that final moment, I also realized something else. I was free. I didn't go far. I didn't have to. The city felt distant, like a dream I could no longer recognize. I stayed with a friend for a few days, mostly keeping to myself, trying to put the pieces together. I had moved out of the apartment, left Elizabeth behind, but the memories, those damned memories, followed me like a shadow. I spent my days pacing, thinking about everything I had lost, everything I had given up, the life I had with Elizabeth, the years of shared moments, and now, nothing. It all felt like an illusion. I couldn't avoid the guilt, though. It lingered like a constant ache in my chest. I questioned my own decisions. Had I done enough to fight for the relationship? Could I have seen the warning signs sooner? But deep down, I knew the truth. No amount of effort would have changed what had already been broken. Elizabeth had made her choices. She had chosen him. The days blurred into one another. I spent time with friends, tried to stay busy, but nothing seemed to ease the ache. I threw myself into work, hoping the distractions would numb the pain, but it didn't work. The ache remained, a dull throb in the back of my mind. And then one evening, a message from Elizabeth arrived. My phone buzzed, and for a moment I debated ignoring it. But I couldn't. I opened the message. I'm sorry, Michael. I've made a mess of everything. I know I can't fix this, but I need you to know I never wanted to hurt you. I don't know what happened. I stared at the screen for a long time. The words echoed in my mind, but they didn't feel like an apology anymore. They felt like an attempt to reach for something that was long gone. I couldn't respond. Not because I didn't want to, but because I knew that any response would pull me back into a situation I was trying to escape. I had to let go. I had to move on. I deleted the message and turned off my phone. It was time to face the truth. My life, the one I had built with Elizabeth, was over. I had no choice but to rebuild. So I started small. I took walks, went to the gym, something I had neglected for far too long. Slowly, the fog began to clear. I realized that the world didn't end when she walked out of my life. Kept moving, and so did I. It was hard, so damn hard, but every day I got a little stronger. The pain lessened, and little by little I started to feel like myself again. And though the past would always be a part of me, I knew now that I couldn't live in it anymore. The weeks that followed felt like a blur. There were moments of clarity, moments of doubt, and moments when I found myself questioning if I had made the right choice by walking away from Elizabeth. But the more time I spent alone, the more I realized how much I had been suffocating in that relationship. I had forgotten what it was like to be me, to enjoy my own company, to make decisions for myself. It was freeing in a way and terrifying in another. I had to learn how to trust myself again, how to navigate a world without the constant fear of betrayal lurking around every corner. I spent my days focusing on work. It was the one thing that had remained constant, the one thing I knew I could rely on. Slowly, my professional life started to flourish again. I began taking on more projects, working late nights, and allowing myself to get lost in the work. But the loneliness was always there. It wasn't something I could ignore, no matter how hard I tried. Every evening, when I got home, the silence would hit me. It was a stark reminder of what I had left behind, of what Elizabeth had taken from me. One day, while out grabbing lunch at a local cafe, I ran into someone I hadn't seen in a while. Her name was Sarah. She was a former colleague, someone I had always admired for her strength and independence. "Michael, right?" she said, her voice warm as she smiled at me. "It's been forever." I was caught off guard, but there was something comforting about seeing a familiar face. We chatted for a while, and she invited me to join her for dinner the following week. At first, I hesitated. I wasn't sure if I was ready to meet someone new, to open myself up again. But I realized that I had to try. Life wasn't going to wait for me to heal. The dinner with Sarah was easy, surprisingly so. We talked about everything, our old jobs, life in the city, our dreams. For the first time in what felt like ages, I felt seen. Not as Elizabeth's husband, not as the person who had been betrayed, but as me. It wasn't love, not yet, but it was something I hadn't felt in a long time, hope. As the days turned into weeks, I started seeing Sarah more. Our conversations became more personal, and I began to open up about my past, about everything that had happened with Elizabeth. But I never compared Sarah to her. That was one thing I promised myself. I wouldn't let my past dictate my future. I had to learn to be with someone who valued me for who I was now, not who I had been. And with Sarah, I began to see the possibility of a future that didn't involve betrayal or heartbreak. It was a slow process, building trust again, opening myself to vulnerability, but for the first time in a long time, it felt like I was walking in the right direction. As I walked through this new chapter, I kept reminding myself that healing wasn't linear. There were days when I felt like I had it all figured out, and there were days when the weight of the past would hit me again. But the difference was that I no longer felt like I was drowning. I was learning how to float. It was a slow climb back, but I was starting to feel like myself again. Sarah and I continued seeing each other, and with every passing day, I realized just how much I had needed this. She didn't rush anything. She respected my space, but also made me feel like I was worth her time. One afternoon, we sat on her porch, the city skyline behind us. The sun was setting, casting an orange glow over everything. It felt peaceful, like I could breathe again. "I'm glad we're doing this," I told her quietly, looking out over the horizon. "Me too," she said with a smile. "It feels right, doesn't it?" I nodded, realizing that, for the first time in a long while, I wasn't haunted by my past. I had started a new chapter, one where I wasn't defined by betrayal, but by the choices I was making now. It wasn't perfect. There were still moments when the shadows of my past crept in, but they no longer controlled me. I was starting to build a life worth living again. And for the first time, I felt hope. Life had a way of testing me, but I wasn't afraid anymore. With Sarah, things were uncomplicated. We didn't talk about my past often, and when we did, it was with respect for what I'd been through. The weight of the previous months still lingered, but it no longer defined me. One evening, as we walked through a park, Sarah took my hand. "You're not the same person you were before," she said, looking up at me. "You've changed." I nodded. I had to. I couldn't stay stuck in the past forever. And it was true. I had learned to let go. It wasn't easy, but I had to stop living in the shadow of Elizabeth's betrayal. I had to stop allowing it to control my future. I spent more time focusing on things I had forgotten. My passions, my goals. I enrolled in a photography class I had always been interested in but had never pursued. Felt freeing, like I was finally coming into my own. And Sarah, she was part of that new life. I couldn't predict where it would go, but for the first time I wasn't afraid to see. The more time passed, the more I realized that holding on to the past only kept me from moving forward. Elizabeth's shadow was no longer cast over me. I was learning to let go, to release the hurt, the anger, and the bitterness that had defined so much of my life. One evening, I sat down and wrote a letter. It wasn't to Elizabeth, no, I had nothing left to say to her. It was to myself a declaration of freedom. A promise that I would never allow anyone, not even her, to take away my peace again. It wasn't about forgiveness. It was about acceptance. I accepted what happened, what I couldn't change. And in doing so, I freed myself from the emotional prison I had built. I showed Sarah the letter a few days later. "This is part of my healing," I told her. "I had to write it." She read it silently, then looked up at me, her eyes soft. "I'm proud of you," she said. "You're finally free." And for the first time in years, I believed it. The road hadn't been easy, and there were still scars, but they no longer controlled me. I was my own person again. I had built something new from the ashes of my past, and I wasn't about to let anything ruin that. The future no longer seemed like an endless road of uncertainty. With every step I took, I felt stronger, more in control of my life. My days with Sarah were filled with laughter and lightness, something I hadn't known in a long time. She wasn't my savior, and I wasn't hers. We were two people learning how to live again. I had also begun to repair my relationship with my friends. I spent time with people who genuinely cared about me, who reminded me of the importance of connection, of trust. One evening, as Sarah and I sat in a small cafe, I looked around at the life I was building. There were still challenges ahead, no doubt, but I wasn't afraid of them anymore. "You know," I said, gazing out the window, "I've been thinking a lot about what I've learned through all of this." Sarah smiled, encouraging me to continue. "I've learned that sometimes you have to lose everything to realize what you truly need. I don't need to chase after validation or stay stuck in the past. I just need to be true to myself." She squeezed my hand. "And you are. Every day." I looked at her, knowing that this wasn't the end of my journey. It was just the beginning. The path wasn't always clear, but I knew that with every choice I made, I was getting closer to the man I was meant to be. And that was enough for now. Thank you for following this story. If you've ever experienced betrayal or heartbreak, you know the power of letting go and rebuilding. It's not easy, but it's worth it. If you're still watching, I want to hear from you. How did you find the strength to move on after something painful? Share your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories that remind us of the strength we all have inside.